Welcome to this Java Break with Basis. My name is Nico Spence. I'm the Chairman and CEO of Basis International, and I'm joined today by Jeff Ash, a Basis engineer who has key responsibility of developing the Enterprise Manager. And that's most appropriate as our topic today is System Administration Simplified, and the Enterprise Manager is the key component of the tool set that we offer to help you administrate your systems. The focus of today's session is to point out features we've added in BBJ 10 and also recap some other features that you may have not used extensively that'll help you work smarter rather than harder with Basis products. So let's look at our agenda for today. We're going to have a look at the new installer. The new installer, new to BBJ 10, give you some background to its capabilities, why we created a new installer, and some of the benefits you'll gain from using it. We'll have a look at the Enterprise Manager update in the area of the database tools. We'll talk about the admin API that we've unveiled. We'll spend quite a bit of time today looking at user authentication and some of the new capabilities we've added to make your lives easier. We'll also touch on the Builtin Web Server. As you know, it offers capabilities to consume web services and offer web services. And of course, it also has the capability through the web server to deploy your applications via web start. That really gives you the capability of doing zero deployment. No need to go out and visit any particular desktop to install any software or keep it updated. But we'll focus in particular on your web apps, the ability to configure an existing graphical application for the browser user interface. We'll show you how you can configure and deploy your application in the browser user interface and show you some samples of code that we have available for you to review. And then we'll summarize the session and take your questions. So let's have a look and talk about the new installer. Now, it's a bit of deja vu. When Install Shield was announced as a product that was coming to its end of life, it sounded like the same story we've heard before. Basis has gone through several iterations of using third-party tools to do the installation of our product. And when we came around to the prospect of re-engineering and reporting to a new tool, we made the decision to actually create our own. So let's see what the benefits are of having created our own Basis custom installer. Well, firstly, it's Java-based, and that gives us the ability to be cross-platform. We have a single executable for all platforms rather than have different methodologies to roll out for Windows or Linux type environments. You can either install it automatically if your system is set up to recognize a .jar file and associate it with Java, or you could manually start it by typing in the command line Java --jar and then put in the actual jar file that you've downloaded from our website. We still provide you the ability to have the silent install, and that response file format has changed, and we've added additional functionality, and it's editable as a .properties file. So you can edit that in the Basis IDE. The Basis IDE is capable of editing key value pairs. You can make the changes as required to your response file to create a silent install. One of the major benefits of the new installer is that it has a much smaller footprint, up to a third smaller than the prior installer that we used. Another key benefit is that it's much faster, up to 5 times faster, obviously dependent upon the capabilities of the system that you're running on. It'll determine how much faster that would be, but up to 5 times faster, a very significant improvement. One of the great new features we've added is the ability to do installs via web start. So you have the option to check the box to make the installation available in web start. That means that, once again, no more scurrying around from place to place. You could actually have it set up that the installer can be launched across the internet via web start, and you could install the application from a remote site. You could simply provide a link in an email or on a web page to the user and create a silent install with a response file. So very easy, very much more efficient, and I'm sure a lot less work than you might have been following in the past. So within the Enterprise Manager, you'll see here under the JNLP configuration and in the Install tab, we've checked the box to allow remote install, and we have a link, and that would be the link that you would provide with the email and or the URL on a intranet type web page to do a remote install. Let's turn our attention to our database tools and some of the enhancements we've made to the database tool set. We'll focus a bit in today's session on the Basis SQL Query Engine performance. We'll talk about three components of that: the table and database analysis queue. We'll talk about query analysis, and we'll try and explain the difference between those two. And we'll talk about JDBC, ODBC Prefetch and connection caching and how that'll affect the performance of your SQL queries. We'll spend a bit of time talking about the concept of our new database update wizard, what functionality it provides for you. And just a reminder, we're not going to dwell on this in today's session, but a reminder that we do have the SPROC creation wizard within the Enterprise Manager. Again, a great productivity saving if you want to start utilizing stored procedures to get access to your data via an SQL tool like a third-party report writing tool, be it Crystal Reports or the open source iReport WYSIWYG report writing tool. Quite often you'll want to give access to that data via stored procedure to get the fastest access. So we have a wizard available to make it easy for you to create a stored procedure to access your data. And of course you can also manage your triggers from within the Enterprise Manager. Again, we won't dwell on that much in today's session. Let's firstly talk about table analysis. So previously we gave you the ability to analyze your table, and knowledge is power. In this case, the more that the SQL engine knows about the structure of the data in the table, the better the performance it is going to have in accessing that data. It'll know whether to use the first key or the second key or the third key to access the same set of data. So the SQL engine analysis will deliver that knowledge to enable the engine to perform optimally against the data. The analysis will review the list of tables. It'll have a look at the structure of the table. It'll have a look at the data in context to the keys that are available to gain access to that data. So it'll look at the shape of the data, and that's important. It's not sufficient just to know the structure of the data, the indexes that might be on the table. It's also important to know that if one traverses the table through one particular index versus another, which one is actually faster in getting the same piece of information out. So that allows us and leads us to the point where we can have a query that is optimized for the actual contents of the table data. So we give you the ability, as we have in the past, to do a manual analysis of a table. But we've now added the ability to do automatic analysis. So let's talk about those two different approaches. The manual analysis can be initiated from within the Enterprise Manager, and now new to BBJ 10, we've given you a program API, the admin API, to be able to kick off a table analysis from within your own utility programs. You can queue that analysis, so the Enterprise Manager will queue up the tables to be analyzed, making sure that the processor is not sluggish during that procedure. And you can manage that queue in the Enterprise Manager. New to BBJ 10 is the ability to have an automatic table analysis. That will be initiated on access by the SQL engine to the table if it's never been analyzed, if you've added indexes or you've dropped indexes from the table, or if the table has been recreated programmatically from scratch, perhaps via some BBJ code. If you've added a column or dropped a column, and if more than 50% of the records have been added to the table since the last analysis, that of course would have had a substantial effect on the shape of the data in that table, and thereby necessitating a review of the structure and creating the optimal query path to the same set of data. This again, through the automated process, is added to the background queue for analysis, and you can toggle the auto analysis with a flag in the Enterprise Manager. So this is what the table analysis queue looks like. So there's an option to call that up and have a look at the status of the analysis. You can view the progress. You can adjust the refresh rate down at the bottom to a particular refresh rate to show it in the Enterprise Manager, and you could decide to stop analysis on one or more of the tables if you so need to perhaps have exclusive access to a table. And coming up soon in the admin API will be the ability for you to programmatically stop the analysis as well. Let's move on to the secondary part of optimizing our SQL query engine, and that is the query analysis. Now, query analysis is more of a passive process whereby we log access to the data. In other words, the SQL access to the data is logged. That runs automatically, continuously updates the log of information of access, and it really accumulates the where clause usage information. It's provided as an aid to the database administrator. It'll give you information of the columns used in the where clause, whether those columns are indexed, and the frequency of use. So if you have a lot of queries going against your M key data file, your X key data file, your V key data file, and they're not optimally indexed for that particular query, maybe it's time for your database administrator to decide to add indexes. It's important to understand, of course, that the information provided here is merely an aid to the database administrator. There's no real intelligence contained in it, and it's a tool. It's not a panacea to resolving the optimal structure of your data. So the database administrator still needs to understand the contents of the data and understand the needs of those SQL queries that are going to run against that data to determine whether or not to add an index or whether or not to restructure the form of the table. So this is what that information looks like. If we check and select the Query Analysis tab for a particular database, we'll see the tables that have been queried. It'll show the column list of the where clause that has been employed against that table and give us a score of how often that combination has been used in queries and give you the information as to whether there's currently an index that's been used by the SQL engine. So those are both very useful tools to help you optimize your SQL access to your database. But another tool, another aspect of the configuration that you need to bear in mind is the JDBC ODBC Prefetch setting. What that determines is how many records are fetched in a particular connection to the database, in a particular read. So if it's set to 1, obviously it's only going to fetch 1 record at a time. And that will reduce the network round trip dramatically if you're fetching more than 1 record at a time. So particularly useful in high latency type deployments. If you're moving your service to the cloud or you have remote access to the database through ODBC or JDBC type query, then you should add or up the prefetch setting in the ODBC or JDBC driver to a substantial amount. So that reduces the round trips across the network, and of course that latency can be avoided. So dramatic performance improvements will be gained in high latency settings. That value is configurable on a per connection basis, and we also recommend that you utilize connection pooling to reduce the amount of time taken to re-establish a connection. So in the JDBC ODBC configuration, this example here, I have a screenshot where I have a prefetch size, and this is the one that you should set to a value that will give you optimal performance. And you'll see also just below that I have checked the use connection cache to make sure that subsequent connections occur much faster across the network. So we had a little example of a test that we ran, and this is some sample code that we should be making available to you in our demos in the future, so look out for it. But it's an ability to set up a connection configuration across a wide area network type connection from one server to another. And here we see some examples with different prefetch values. And the 3 values we have in this sample is 0, 10, and 1000. And so we see in this next graph our prefetch results from our little sample database table. So when we have a prefetch value of 1000, obviously those round trips are reduced dramatically, and so our time has dropped from 24 seconds for a query down to something approaching 1 second. So we'd strongly recommend that you look at some of those values and switch them on. In BBJ 10, they're optimally constructed to give you the best performance across a wide area network. The next tool that I want to talk about is our database update wizard, and that's a fairly sort of generic and obscure description of what it can achieve. So let's talk about the kind of problem statement that we might have. Why would we need a database update wizard? Let's consider a situation where Either we've taken a new release of some software or we've initiated some program changes that have necessitated changes to the underlying database. Perhaps we've added a new field to the database table. Perhaps we've decided to add a variable length record to the table and move to v-keyed file structure. Or maybe we've decided to add multiple indexes as a result of our query analysis results that we've seen through the database tools. So all of these requirements can force a need to make changes to the underlying database tables. The end user, of course, wants the least downtime to the application during the process of implementing the new software. And in some cases, perhaps these old tables are several gigabytes in size, and it's not a trivial task to copy across that table and create a newly structured database table. So the Database Update Wizard presents an opportunity to resolve those problems. The solution is that the wizard compares the old and the new data dictionary. So you just lay down the new data dictionary, and if you don't already have one, create one for the old database tables, the M-keyed files that you have. And the wizard will compare those two and create online copy jobs to create the new data files with the new structure. So it gives you some ability to interact with the wizard to selectively retain certain columns. Say you have a new column, perhaps it's an implementation of an upgrade to a packaged solution, and you've done some customization in the interim and you want to preserve that customization. You can do that. You can optimally select to retain a column that looks like it's been dropped from the new table definition. You can then run this in the background, and this may run for several minutes, several hours, or perhaps even several days until the two databases are in sync. And then it's a simple task to swap out the old data with the new data. You can merely bring the system down, have the users out for the minimal amount of time, implement the new software, and switch out the database, and you're up and running on the new database. One of the other often requested features was for us to give you programmatic access to the functionality contained in the Enterprise Manager. And we've responded to that with the fully fledged Admin API. That gives you programmatic access to all the Enterprise Manager functions. This will work either in Java or in BBJ. And some good use cases may be to facilitate deployment. So, for example, when you're installing a new site, you may wish to construct the actual database files, set up users, give them particular permissions. All of that is contained within the Enterprise Manager's functionality, but you could programmatically create that on a new installation. The Database Update Wizard, in fact, utilizes some aspects of the Admin API to be able to launch and control an online copy job. That would be another reasonable use case. But have a look at the Admin API Java docs and the basis documentation, or have a look at code completion in the IDE to see all the functionality that is available to you. Here's a screenshot of the Java documentation of the basis Admin API. In fact, one other good use case is one that we've used with the Barista tool, whereby Barista takes advantage of the Admin API to interrogate the Enterprise Manager to determine which users are available, and then automatically creates them or offers an interface for the Barista administrator to decide to add those users to the Barista installation. And that's probably a good segue into user authentication. We've added significant new function in BBJ 10 to user authentication, and let's talk about that. User authentication in BBJ is handled in three different ways. We can administer them through the BBJ Enterprise Manager, adding users and restricting their permissions. We can utilize the Windows username and password structure to give access to the BBJ users. Or we can use LDAP, Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. And the example we're going to look at to some great extent today is the Windows Active Directory implementation of LDAP. So within the Enterprise Manager, we select the server information and check the tab for environment. We can switch on or switch off user authentication. And then within users and authentication, on the authentication settings tab, we have the choice of using BBJ authentication, using Microsoft Windows authentication, or using LDAP Active Directory authentication. Let's look at the components of Windows user authentication, which is relatively new to BBJ. It utilizes the Windows operating system username and password. It supports the Windows user level permissions in BBJ 10 and higher. Non-Windows user level permissions have been supported in all previous versions of BBJ. So file permissions are then handled at the operating system level for BBJ data files. It provides the equivalent functionality to the older Pro5NT data server functionality. But we're going to focus a bit more today on the LDAP user authentication. Remember, the focus of today's session was working smarter, not harder. So in keeping with that concept, you don't want to have to administer your users in more than one place. So if you already have an Active Directory LDAP type user management structure in your organization, why not just point BBJ to that structure and take advantage of its capabilities, and thereby only needing to manage your users in one place. So there are a couple of things we need to set up to make these two components work hand in glove. Firstly, we're going to need to determine the information relating to the LDAP server, and then we're going to need to make sure we have at least two of the queries, the user list query and the permissions search query, so we can make these two interoperable between BBJ services, BBJ Enterprise Manager's capability, and the Active Directory LDAP management. So in order to assist me in demonstrating this functionality, let me hand over to Jeff Ash, and he's going to take us through an example of setting up BBJ to utilize LDAP Active Directory authentication. Over to you, Jeff.
So let's first look at what we need to do to set up BBJ. From the Enterprise Manager, we're going to click on Users and Authentication. This allows us access to the configuration settings for users. Over on the Authentication Settings tab, when we click on that, we will see a list of the authentication options. Currently we're using BBJ's authentication mechanism, but we're going to switch that to use LDAP or Active Directory authentication. Notice here we enter the IP address or machine name of our Active Directory server, a port, 389 is the default for Active Directory, and then a prepend value that will be added to the beginning of usernames in order to authenticate. Active Directory requires this domain value prepended to the usernames in order for authentication to occur properly. BBJ makes it easy to check your settings, so we can click on Check Settings, type in our username and password, and it will tell us that it was successful. So we know that these settings are correct here. We'll touch on the next section here, which is our user list search query and our permission search query. What this does is it allows BBJ to be very flexible in how it interacts with your current Active Directory setup. To help you understand this, let's take a look at the ADSI edit tool on our Active Directory server. Notice this server is just using the default configuration for the Active Directory setup. But what we've done is we've added a new node under Program Data for Basis, User Permissions, and then under User Permissions will be an entry for each user, including the permissions that they have for using the Enterprise Manager and accessing various features and functionality of BBJ. The beauty of this is that you can use your own structure here. We've set up one ourselves here in this format, and that's what our demonstration here will use. However, you can be as flexible as you want. You can create any directory structure that you want. You just have to have a location that you can store the BBJ permissions. Notice also here there's a location where Windows puts all of the Windows user accounts. It puts them under here. We see our administrator user here. It's important that we know the structure and the location within that directory structure so that we can locate the information and tell BBJ how to locate the information necessary to manage users. This is where the user search query and permission search queries come in. So now let's look at the next section here, and that would be the user and permission search queries. The search queries allow BBJ to be very flexible in the way that it interacts with your existing Active Directory configuration. By providing a query configuration setting here, you can set up your Active Directory in whatever format and whatever structure works best for your current organizational needs. So let's take a look at what that would look like. To do that, we'll click on Edit LDAP Search Queries, and it will pull up a list of queries. We have a couple here that I've already added ahead of time. Let's edit the user's query, and we can take a look and see here. What we've done is we've specified the path to that user's node that was located in our Active Directory configuration. It's the full path to the user's node, which is where all of the user accounts are located, users and group accounts. Notice it's com, basis, users. And so that's the path that we will put in there for our query. Com, basis, users. Now in this part, in the filter, what we're going to do is put in that we want object class type of only person to show up. We don't want groups to show up. We just want user accounts. And so we put that in here. You have other settings where you can further limit that and specify other filter criteria. The test button will allow you to test this very easily. And once you click the test button, you'll see the results of your query. And if it looks like it's correct, then we're good. And in this case it is. It shows the 3 user accounts that are on our Windows box. The permissions query then also allows you to point to the location that you have your BBJ permissions located. In our particular example, we have those located under a node that we added to program data called basis user permissions, and then there'll be an entry for each user account that has BBJ permissions underneath here. You can see administrator. We already have that added in there. Coming back over to here in the Enterprise Manager, we can take a look at that query, and we point to the location of that user permissions directory or node that was in our Active Directory setup. Underneath there, we know that since it's all basis stuff, we can just assume that only user permissions are going to be in there. If you decide for whatever reason to put something else in there, you can certainly do that, but you'll need to modify your filter query. So notice here, your filter query can be as complex as you would like, and you're not going to be forced into any kind of a paradigm that we've defined. You can use whatever structure makes sense for your organization, and BBJ can be configured to work with that. Again, the test button will return a list of the items in there, and you can make sure that your query is returning what you expect. It is, and so we're going to select those queries, the users one for our user list search query, the permission search query, and then we're going to click the save button. That saves our settings. Whenever we make changes to the authentication settings here, it's going to ask us to log back in, because it wants to make sure that we are logging in with whatever current user authentication mechanism we're set up to use. Now notice here on the Users tab, we now have a list of the users from the Active Directory server instead of BBJ. We have administrator, we have guest, and this KRBTGT user. Now that we've seen that configuration work, let's just show how how changes on one side will affect the other side. So let's add a user account here to our Active Directory server. Let's scroll down here, add a user. There's our user. I'm going to set the password. We now have a user account. Let's immediately go over to the Enterprise Manager, hit refresh on our user list, and we see our user account show up in the list. Notice it does not have any permissions yet, and we can see that over here when we look at our user permissions node. There is no JAsh user under there, so the assumption is that that user does not have any permissions. So we see how making changes on the Windows Active Directory side shows up in Enterprise Manager. Now let's make a change in the Enterprise Manager to show how that affects the Active Directory. So let's add some permissions for the JAsh user. Let's say that JAsh is allowed to add users, view SQL connections, view BBJ processes, and view open files. I'm going to save that configuration there. Now when we go over and look at the Active Directory side, if we refresh our node, we can see that BBJ has actually added a node to our Active Directory server for JAsh with appropriate permissions. If we look at the properties on that user, we can see that the description attribute gets all of the permissions added in there. We can see JDBC connections, add user, processes, and open files. So you can see how powerful this feature is in BBJ.
Well, thanks, Jeff. There you have it. A really good example of working smarter rather than harder, utilizing existing infrastructure for managing users, managing permissions of users, and integrating that into your BBJ installation. Let's move on to the piece de resistance of BBJ 10, and that's the browser user interface. And you may have been asking yourself the question, well, this sounds like a great deal. How do I manage to take advantage of the ability to deploy my graphical application in a browser? So let's talk about that today. How do you configure and deploy your browser user interface application? There's several things that you need. Firstly, you need a web server. Well, the good news is we're shipping a web server now in Enterprise Manager. You need to give your application that you want to run in the browser a title. That's your pre-written GUI application. You need to tell the buoy configuration in Enterprise Manager the name of the program, the location of your config.bbx file, the working directory, and pass on any command line arguments that your program requires. You then need to be able to harvest the link, so we generate that link for you for your browser. And then you need to do some testing to ensure that your application functions appropriately in the browser. So I mentioned earlier that we have the Builtin Web Server. So under the Servers tab within the Enterprise Manager, you'll see that there's a web server that's pre-configured and set up for you. You can make those changes in this tab if you need to. The buoy configuration and deployment, as I mentioned earlier, is very simple. We ship the demo product with several examples of using buoy, and I've clicked on one here called Print Invoice, and you'll see that we need to provide to it the Print Invoice application title. The URL is generated for you, so you don't need to edit that. The program name you need to provide. You need to tell the buoy configuration where your config.bbx file is. You need to give it the working directory and pass on any arguments, and you're pretty much done. Then we can harvest that URL, just right click on it, and you have the option to launch it directly from within Enterprise Manager or copy the link. And then we run the application. So here's that sample invoice form where we're going to print the invoice, and there it is running in our browser. So the question really is, are you ready for buoy? Is your application ready for buoy? There's some things you can check first to make sure that you're compatible, because there are some features of SysGUI that are yet to be released in the product. A current list of the completed features is available in the buoy Getting Started guide, and I'll show you in a minute how we can get there. And to add and to whet your appetite, you can have a look at the BBJ Buoy Showcase. That gives you access to some source code. You can click on a button to see the actual source code, and these are working examples. So they're running off a server hosted by Basis in the cloud. So let's have a quick look at that. So here we are at the Basis website. Let's go to Products and do Downloads. And within Downloads, if we select BBJ and Barista, we'll see we have an item under Help says BBJ Buoy Getting Started. If we click on that, we'll see this Google Docs document. That's a living, breathing document. We update it all the time, so it'll tell you what features are already implemented, which features are not yet implemented. And let's click on the See Also piece, and down here you'll see under See Also we have BBJ Buoy Showcase. If we click on that and go to this link, and of course we can harvest that link and pass it around, we'll actually launch an HTML page that'll serve as a examples demo launcher of all of these functions. So for example, let's imagine we wanted to see the source code to produce the sample button. If we click on that, we can see the actual source code. Let's close that out. And let's look at a Barista customer maintenance program running in Buoy. So this one looks like it's been sized to run on something like an iPhone, and Barista has that sort of functionality for you. It'll give you the screen layout that you might expect. It'll allow you to format and construct your form to fit into a particular form factor, be it an Android mobile device or an iPhone type device. But otherwise, the functionality is that which we might expect from a BBJ application. The only difference being that this is running in a browser, no JVM required. Well, we've seen a practical example of how simple it would be to be able to launch your application in a browser, run it in a browser. And we've shown you how simple it is to configure that utilizing the system administration features of Enterprise Manager. So let's move on and summarize what we've covered today. We've looked at the new installer. We've looked at an Enterprise Manager update, and I've tried to highlight those features that you would find most useful in improving your productivity, working smarter rather than harder. So database tools that we've enhanced, the admin API, user authentication choices that you have, and some more information on the functionality of the Builtin Web Server. Apart from web services and web start, we can also use it to launch applications that we've written that are Buoy compliant, that will run in our browser user interface. So before we take your questions and respond to those that you posted, let's talk about the next Java break. In a couple of weeks' time, we'll have integrating PDF output into your application. And that could be as simple as making a change in your config.bbx file. No code changes required. All your reports that might have been written with a print at column type statement can now be rendered in a PDF format. So take the time, probably about half an hour, come and join us on November the 17th. To hear about PDF output. We have several choices to get there. Some require a little bit more work if you want smarter, neater looking applications or neater looking output, but others are really easy to implement. Same time, same place. So let's take your questions.